friends! This is Amy from All Well Workshop, and today we're going to make some continuous bias binding. This is sort of a companion to this risograph print that All Well just put out. So let's just get started. Let's make some bias binding. So we will start by cutting a square of fabric. I'm using this fabric because it'll be really easy to see our grain line because it is striped. And I'm planning to cut a 12 by 12 inch square because you can use any size square to start with, and the larger size square you have, the more bias binding you'll have. And 12 by 12 isn't that big of a piece to start with, but you'll be surprised by how much we end up with from a 12 by 12 square. Yay, so here I have my 12 by 12 square of fabric. And now I'm going to go ahead and cut this piece of fabric in half diagonally. Like this. Being indecisive. So now I have two squares of fabric that have a right angle in the corner. You're going to go ahead and you're going to flip one piece down so that two of the straight edges match. So we're keeping the grain line intact. And I'm going to go ahead and line it up so that it matches perfectly. And you want the right sides to be together, and it will look like this. Now I'm going to add some pins, because the next step is to sew this together all along this bottom edge using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm sewing it with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then you're going to press that seam right open. So now you want to lay this piece on the table so that your bias edge, which is the stretchier diagonal grain edge, is running parallel, and now the seam will be diagonal. So here's our bias edge, and here's our seam. Now on the wrong side of our fabric, we are going to go ahead and draw some guidelines. And I'm going to do mine 1 inch wide because that's how wide I want this bias tape to be, but you can do it at whatever width you're going to need. And make sure you're doing this on the wrong side. So now you can see these diagonal guidelines I've drawn all the way along. So now is the weirdest part. We want to get this edge and this edge to match up with right sides together. So it feels really weird, I'm warning you now. Feels like it should not work. But you're going to go ahead and line it up and pin, and you're going to pin it so that the first strip, which you can see sort of starting to be alive here, is offset from the rest of the tube. So you don't want to start your triangle here on the edge, because then you won't have anywhere to start cutting your strip of bias tape. So you have to go ahead and offset the first stripe off to the side. And now we're going to use pins. And you want to place your pins at about 1/4 inch to simulate where your seam line will be, so that you can make sure your strip lines are meeting up when you fold it back. So now we're going to go ahead and check. So this is what we want to see. See how this line is meeting up with our pins, and it's making a long continuous line that we'll be able to cut. So I'm going to go ahead and keep pinning since things are lining up. And again, this is the weirdest part. It feels like it's not going to work, but it is. And you'll also have an offset at the end here. So here's our weird pinned tube. You can see how it's kind of a continuous circle, like that. So we've formed a pinned tube. Now you're going to go ahead and sew this using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So once you sew, you want to take a good look at what you just did. So this is the seam I just sewed. Now you want these lines to match up across this seam allowance as perfectly as you can. Now if they're a little off, it's okay because they're just your cutting guidelines, and you can kind of keep in mind that you're cutting 1-inch strips. But you just want to check and make sure they're not way off, and if they are, you'll want to seam rip and try to line them up and try again. Okay, so now is the fun part. This is where you get to just sort of cut your whole tube apart all the way around the circle. So you start at that offset side and then you just cut, cut, cut all the way. So starting with 12 inches, a 12-inch square, I've made bias binding that is twice as tall as me, taller. So I would guess this is like almost 12 feet of bias binding. I should probably measure it for real. So from here, you can definitely leave your bias binding like this, especially if your patterns call for flat binding. But if you want to turn it into actual bias tape, you can use a bias tape maker. So to turn bias strips into bias tape, you would essentially fold and press your strip in half, and then each of those sides would go in half again so that they meet in the middle and then fold in half. You can do that by hand, but it's very tedious. So if you want it to go a little quicker, you can use a bias tape maker like these, which come in multiple sizes. You feed your strip through like this and press it, and it helps facilitate that fold. So I would press down and then press in half again. So our continuous bias binding print walks you through all of those steps. It also looks really pretty on a wall. And then we also have the same infographic available on our blog for free.